The Heavy Weapons Guy, or Heavy for short, is the closest thing that TF2 has to a mascot. He is displayed prominently on the box cover, and he was the subject of the very first Meet the Team video. Yet, despite how prolific he is within the game's artwork and promotional material, Heavy is less omnipresent in the game itself. In a word, Heavy is a specialist. He's designed to excel in defensive strongholds, but at the cost of general applicability. His low mobility, while not an issue for defending key areas, makes it hard for him to keep up when points are constantly being exchanged. Contrast this with classes like Soldier and Demoman, generalists that are designed to feel comfortable in any situation, while not being as strong in one particular area. Specialists like Heavy aren't necessarily worse than generalists, they're just more situational. But that's what makes specialists so hard to balance. Heavy needs to be slow to balance out his incredible defensive profile, but making Heavy too slow would make no one want to play him. Conversely, if he isn't slow enough, Heavy would be able to exploit his unmatched health pool and DPS to easily push forwards. Trying to balance Heavy revolves around finding just the right mix of mobility and power that makes him fun to play as and against. And as you might imagine, Valve has struggled to find where exactly this balance lies throughout TF2's life. At some points, Heavy has been too fast. At other points, too slow. He's been too strong and he's been too weak. So let's take a look back at the history. Let's look at the evolution of Heavy. Upon TF2's release, Heavy was, unfortunately, one of the worst classes in the game. Not the worst, that title went to Pyro. But Heavy players often struggled to make an impact for one simple reason. Heavy was too slow. In fact, he was even slower than he is today, and not just because he lacked certain unlocks. It took Heavy over a full second just to spin up his minigun, which is about as slow as the modern day Natasha. Once revved up, Heavy's move speed would plummet to 80 hammer units per second, the same speed as a scoped-in sniper. Jump revving, especially around corners, was discovered very early on and did help, but not by much. To add insult to injury, the bullet spread of the minigun was much wider than it is today, which made using it at mid-range feel like you were dealing chip damage at best. Heavy's slow speed and inconsistent damage beyond close range made him incredibly easy to exploit. Despite his high health, Heavy would quickly drop to focus fire. Enemies could use the terrain to their advantage by popping in and out from corners to chip away at the Heavy's health. Spies and snipers especially had a field day against Heavies, even more than they do today. So why did Valve make Heavy so exploitable? Well, I'd said that Heavy's slow speed is to balance out his defensive capabilities, but there's more to it than that. Heavy's minigun was designed for players that weren't proficient in what Valve called twitch aiming, otherwise known as flick aiming. With the minigun being an automatic weapon, Heavy players would instead need to track their opponents, keeping their crosshair over their opponent at all times. Good tracking can be hard in modern day TF2, but back in 2007, twitch aim was seen as the more skill-intensive type of aim by far. To compensate for Heavy's lower emphasis on precise aim, he was designed to have a much greater emphasis on another skill, positional awareness. Revving up your minigun was a huge commitment, which forced players to carefully choose the time and place that they did so. New players would often head straight into battle without a plan and get punished accordingly, while more experienced players knew where to position themselves, when to rev up, and when to rev down and retreat. Good awareness in general was mandatory for playing Heavy due to how vulnerable he was when alone. Making matters worse was the fact that teleporters couldn't be upgraded and were capped at level 1, with a 10-second cooldown between uses. If a Heavy needed to walk to the front line, they could defend themselves from ambushes with their shotgun, since relying on their minigun would often lead to them losing most of their health before they could even rev up. Using your shotgun as heavy is seen as a joke today, but it was genuinely useful in the early stages of the game, if only for this one specific situation. Heavy wasn't useless, but he was incredibly exploitable if alone and out in the open, which forced players to develop a level of positional awareness that wasn't required for most other classes. Yet, despite his many glaring flaws, Heavy had the potential to be the single most terrifying thing to fight in the game. He was a pushover on his own, but when backed by a pocket medic, Heavy was seemingly unkillable. To understand why, we need to take a closer look at Heavy's health. Without any overheal, Heavy maxes out at 300 health. That's certainly a lot, but not more than what any other power class can dish out with a single clip. 3 grenades, 4 splash rockets, 3 scattergun meat shots, all of these can drop a Heavy within seconds. With overheal, however, Heavy's health rises to a beefy 450, with the passive healing of the minigun constantly keeping him topped off. No single soldier or scout can kill a Heavy if he has a pocket medic, assuming equal skill levels, and even demo men would struggle unless they happen to have cover. Countering a skilled Heavy medic combo required one of 2 things: well-coordinated focus fire, which was hard to come by in a pub, or a fully charged headshot, which deals exactly 450 health. A backstab could work too, but only if the medic wasn't watching his pockets back and calling spies out. So Heavy, upon TF2's release, was simultaneously an exploitable pushover and arguably the most powerful class in the game, depending on whether or not he had a pocket medic. This seemingly paradoxical dynamic made the prospect of rebalancing Heavy require some careful thought, as Valve would explain in a blog post in July of 2008. Their goal for the upcoming Heavy update was to make Heavy more viable without a medic, while ensuring that any new items didn't make Heavy even more powerful with the medic. Valve also went on to explain how they're very wary of reducing a class's weaknesses when it comes to designing new weapons. Keep this quote in mind, as we'll be revisiting it later on. Anyways, after a month of taking feedback from the community, Valve finally released the Heavy update in August, and along with it, Heavy's first batch of unlockable weapons. Let's start with Heavy's new BFG, the Natasha. This thing was broken on release. Not broken as in overpowered, not yet at least, but mechanically broken. It was supposed to slow targets down on hit in exchange for a minus 25% damage penalty, but that damage penalty was bugged. In reality, it was more like minus 33%. The stock minigun already dealt mediocre damage at mid-range due to bullet spread, so reducing that damage even further was a tough pill to swallow. This in turn made the slowdown effect nearly useless, as its strength varied depending on how much damage was being dealt. The Natasha only dealing respectable damage at close range meant that the slowdown effect only made a noticeable impact at close range. But at that range, you'd be better off using stock for its significantly higher DPS. It should come as no surprise then that the Natasha had no chance of competing with the stock minigun. The Killing Gloves of Boxing, or KGB, released with the same stats that it has today, granting critical hits for 5 seconds on kill, in exchange for a 20% slower firing speed. Guaranteed crits on Heavy sounds game-breaking until you realize that you first need to get a melee kill with the slowest class in the game. The KGB were still seen as a straight upgrade to the stock fists, but only because its downside was so negligible. In practice, the KGB weren't very useful outside of exploiting clueless new players. To be fair, those types of players have been plentiful throughout most of TF2's life, resulting in the KGB becoming somewhat of a fan favorite among pubbers. Even if you did manage to get a kill with them, however, switching to your minigun and revving it up would waste 2 of your 5 seconds of crits. This would be a situation where the shotgun could shine, but of course, this update also brought with it an unlock that could potentially outclass the shotgun forever. Valve had high hopes for the sandwich. It's the only weapon to be given its own Meet the Team video, which was posted on the same day as this update. Was it worth the hype? Well, just like today, using the sandwich would heal Heavy over the course of 4 seconds. And although you couldn't throw it to share it with teammates, this version of the sandwich had no cooldown. That's right, Heavy was given access to infinite healing. There was just one catch. Eating the sandwich would only heal up to 120 health at a time, not even half of Heavy's max health. Healing that much every 4 seconds was nothing to scoff at, but it also wasn't always enough to get Heavy back into the fight. You could try eating your sandwich a second time, but doing so would only increase the odds of you getting backstabbed, taunt killed, etc. So believe it or not, the original sandwich didn't completely overshadow the shotgun. It was generally preferred when playing without a medic, but if there was a medic on the team, many Heavies stuck to using the shotgun for self-defense. At the very least, the sandwich fulfilled Valve's original goal of making Heavy better without a medic around, unlike the Natasha and KGB. This update, despite being called the Heavy update, ironically did very little to improve the class. Heavy was just as slow and exploitable after this update as he was before. In the main game at least. Because around the same time, Valve began working with the growing competitive community on a closed beta test. This was an experimental version of the game, where Valve could get feedback on potential balance changes and even new weapons, with one of those new weapons being for Heavy. A pair of gloves that gave Heavy what his players had been craving since day one: speed. Those that knew about this closed beta would just need to wait and see if Valve added these gloves to the main game or not. Thankfully, Heavy players would get a small taste of increased mobility by the end of the year, in December. As of this patch, Engineers' dispensers and teleporters could now be upgraded to level 3. Level 3 teleporters were a big, albeit indirect, buff to Heavy, potentially letting him get to the front line much faster than before. Level 3 dispensers, while not as exciting, gave defensive Heavies a new reliable source of healing other than medics. With that, we've reached the end of 2008. These first 2 years haven't been great for poor Heavy. Valve has done next to nothing when it comes to addressing Heavy's glaring issues, aside from the sandwich making him slightly less dependent on medics. And as the game gets older, the player base continues to improve, making Heavy's weaknesses look even more exploitable. Of course, we're still in the early years of TF2's life, so let's hope that Valve gives the big guy some buffs sooner rather than later. 2009 kicks things off in February with a massive buff to the miniguns. Their bullet spread was reduced, letting them deal more consistent damage at mid-range. This single change made Heavy a lot less exploitable. You could no longer beat a Heavy one-on-one just by staying out of point-blank range. If he was revved up and firing at you, you'd need to take cover to avoid getting torn to shreds. As for the Natasha, more consistent damage at mid-range made its slowdown effect more consistent. Valve even went a step further and made the slowdown a bit stronger, as well as finally fixing its damage penalty. After these buffs, the Natasha was still seen by most to be the inferior minigun, but it was at the very least functional, and even allowed Heavies to play more of a support role by slowing enemies down. Skipping ahead to September, the sandwich received several massive buffs. First and foremost, Heavies could now drop their sandwich onto the ground, healing anyone that picked it up for 50% of their max health. This made Heavy an even better medic partner, which ironically went against the original goal of the item, but Heavy was in such desperate need for buffs that few people complained. That's not all though, because Heavy could also pick the sandwich back up to instantly heal himself for 150 health. This made playing Heavy without a medic much more efficient. Thanks to the bullet spread buff a few months prior, skilled Heavies now had the chance to beat any other class one-on-one, though not without taking significant damage themselves. Prior to this buff, the Heavy would then need to retreat for health, but now they could immediately heal themselves with a dropped sandwich and have enough health left for his next victim. The only issue with dropping your sandwich was that it was a pain to get back. There was no cooldown timer. Instead, you'd either need to visit a resupply cabinet or use a health pack while at full health. Still, even if heavies were only dropping their sandwiches once per lifetime, it was oftentimes a lifesaver. And for heavies that stuck to eating their sandwiches the old-fashioned way, doing so would now heal heavy up to full health, more than double the previous healing rate. What pushed this into borderline overpowered territory was that there was still no cooldown for eating the sandwich normally. It was infinite use unless you dropped it, resulting in moments where a seemingly unkillable heavy repeatedly eats his sandwich until his teammates come to bail him out. The increased healing via taunting is what initially got the most hype, but over time heavy players would learn just how useful dropping their sandwiches to themselves could be. After blessing heavy mains with such a massive buff, Valve seemingly took the rest of 2009 off from heavy rebalances. But starting in January of the following year, something strange happened. Heavy players were beginning to notice that the Natasha slowdown effect felt stronger than they remembered it being. A lot stronger. Alright, so maybe Valve buffed the strength a little bit like they'd done last year. How bad could it be? Oh. The Natasha was undoubtedly buffed sometime around the tail end of 2009, despite it not being listed in any patch notes around that time. Not only did it slow down targets even more, it did so by the same amount regardless of range. A single Natasha heavy could lock you in place from across the map. The only thing that kept the Natasha from being a straight upgrade was its reduced damage, so despite how frustrating it was to fight against, it still wasn't universally hated. Not for another few months at least. Before that, Valve would release a new lunchbox item to potentially rival the sandwich. That item was the Delocos bar. Eating the Delocos bar would heal 60 health and increase your maximum health by 50 for the next 30 seconds. You can see the logic behind this. Part of what makes Heavy so powerful with a pocket medic is that the overheal pushes his health past several important damage thresholds. So the Delocos bar could potentially allow a Heavy to do this on his own. But 50 extra health just wasn't enough to warrant using this over the sandwich. Even if that 50 health was what let you win a fight, chances are you'd simply get picked off by the next guy before you could escape. Skilled heavies with good positional awareness knew to retreat from bad situations long before letting their health get that low, so the Delocos bar wasn't of much use to them. And if you had a medic with you, which was often the case for heavies, the Delocos bar was literally worthless. Your maximum overheal was still capped at 450. Unsurprisingly, the Delocos bar was rarely used. By this point in the game's life, Heavy has only just started to receive meaningful buffs. At the same time, however, the other classes have gotten a handful of unlocks that were seemingly designed to punish Heavy. Soldiers gained the direct hit, letting them reliably kill heavies with 3 direct rockets. Pyros could use the extinguisher to 2-shot unsuspecting heavies, or air blast to push them out of their effective range. Then there was the Sandman. Oh god, the Sandman. This weapon completely invalidated heavies back when it would stun players. And of course, spies and snipers were as lethal as ever. Heavy's slow speed was looking more and more exploitable by the day. Yes, Heavy needs to be slow to an extent. He needs to be exploitable in some way to balance out his power. But by this point it was clear that Heavy was a bit too slow. So on the 28th of April, Valve did the unthinkable. They made Heavy faster. More specifically, they made Heavy's miniguns faster. The time it took to spin up and spin down were both reduced by 25%, and Heavy's movement speed while revved was increased from 80 hammer units per second to 110, the same as today. These were massive buffs. The reduced spin-up time made Heavy much less susceptible to getting ambushed, which in turn left the stock shotgun without much of a purpose. From this point forward, the sandwich would be the superior secondary. Jump revving was even more useful than before, since you could now start firing almost immediately after landing. Heavy's increased movement speed while revved also let him actually dodge attacks, which is important for the class that's expected to soak up damage for his team. And for the first time, Heavy players didn't feel like they needed to be surrounded by their team to be effective. They could now try roaming the map on their own. These buffs were so simple, yet they did so much to improve Heavy as a class. This was incredible. Wait. Heavy had more than just a stock minigun at this point, right? Then that means... oh no. As it turns out, the Natasha's damage penalty was mostly significant for how it made Heavy even easier to kill when ambushed, since it gave the enemy more time to kill you before you killed them. Reducing the Natasha's spin-up time therefore made its damage penalty less of an issue, and the movement speed buff meant that Natasha Heavies could now close the gap between themselves and whoever they were firing at. Yes, you heard that right. The Natasha's slowdown was so strong that a revved up Heavy could catch up to you. Heavy being able to prevent enemies from fleeing in turn made the Natasha's damage penalty even less significant. Targets moving at snail speed are also much easier to track, allowing for even more damage, and basically there was no reason not to use the Natasha over stock, other than fighting sentries and opposing Heavies. It significantly reduced one of Heavy's biggest weaknesses, his slow movement speed when revved up. If you were fighting a Natasha Heavy, you couldn't run away or corner peek like you would against stock. And being forced to take on the class with 300 health and high DPS often ended in the Heavy's favor. Within the span of 5 months, public opinion on the Natasha had flipped entirely. Even Robin Walker, co-developer of TF2, agreed that the Natasha was too strong. But even if the rev time and movement speed buffs were only applied to the stock minigun, these changes wouldn't have been without controversy. Heavy was suddenly a lot less exploitable. Great news for Heavy players, not so much for everyone else. Strategies like ambushing the Heavy or firing at him from a distance were no longer as effective as they'd once been. The player base had to essentially relearn the Heavy matchup. They needed time to adapt. And yet, just 2 months later, Valve would bless Heavies with yet another massive buff. The Sandwich was given a 30-second cooldown on use. This might sound like a nerf at first, since it was no longer possible to eat the Sandwich infinitely. But it made healing yourself by dropping the Sandwich a lot better. Regaining your Sandwich was a pain before, but now you could always count on getting it back 30 seconds later. The wording of the patch notes implied that the method of recharging with the health pack was removed, but no, that was still there on top of the new 30-second cooldown. Heavies could now instantly heal themselves for 150 health every 30 seconds, if not faster with a health pack. This was incredibly useful for Heavy players, as it reduced the positional awareness required to play the class effectively. If you turned a corner at the wrong time and took a few rockets or pills to the face, you could simply drop your Sandwich at your feet and carry on as if nothing had happened. If you overextended into enemy territory and needed to fall back, dropping your Sandwich as you fled meant the enemy would effectively need to deal 450 damage to kill you. And like I explained with Overheal, most classes simply can't deal that much damage within a few seconds. While the buffs to the miniguns back in April made it harder to exploit Heavy when fighting him, the Sandwich buff took it a step further by making it harder to punish a Heavy for being out of position, something that was supposed to be a major weakness of the class. And that's not even mentioning the Natasha, which by this point had quickly become one of the most hated weapons in the game. The player base was starting to lose their patience. So much had changed within such a short span of time. And Valve, in all of their wisdom, saw this and thought to themselves, this seems like the perfect time to release those gloves from the closed beta. The Gloves of Running Urgently, or GRU for short, was released in the Manconomy update of September, just a few months after the Sandwich was buffed. Continuing the trend of unlocks reducing previously well-defined weaknesses, the GRU granted heavies a 30% faster move speed when active, allowing them to run nearly as fast as classes like Pyro and Sniper. Heavies could now reach the battlefield as fast as their teammates. This sounds incredible, and for heavy players it was. But for everyone else, heavies using the GRU would often slow the game down. See, heavy is designed to be an excellent defender, especially when pocketed. Therefore, taking a skilled heavy down can take a lot of time and effort. Up until this point, killing a heavy gave the enemy team ample time to push forwards undeterred. The heavy would need to first wait out their respawn time, then slowly walk back to the fight. But with the GRU, that downtime was reduced significantly. The enemy team would have much less time to push before being faced with a 450 health tank yet again. Contrast this with level 3 sentries. They, like heavies, are excellent at defending and can require a concentrated effort to take down. But once you do destroy that sentry, you know that it'll take a long time for the engineer to get another back up, giving you time to push forwards. A competent heavy using the GRU could ironically slow the game down considerably for everyone else, all while literally slowing players down with the Natasha. Like the recently buffed Sandwich, the GRU also made it easier for a heavy to reposition themselves once they made it to the battlefield. Trying to punish an overextending heavy was hard enough when dropping a Sandwich effectively gave him 450 health, but now he was running away 30% faster than before. You might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the downsides of the GRU yet, and that's because it didn't have any. Well, technically it did have 2 downsides listed in its stats, but neither of them affected the weapon in any meaningful way. First, the GRU had a minus 50% damage penalty. It should go without saying that using melee for damage isn't very effective for the slowest class in the game, so this was a non-issue. Keeping the GRU out would also cause you to lose 6 health per second. This sounds like a notable downside on paper, but there were a few problems with it. Medics would not only out-heal the self-damage of the GRU, but they'd also build Uber at a slightly faster rate. Adding to this synergy, the GRU made Heavy a better Uber recipient by letting him get into an ideal position more quickly. If the Heavy didn't have a medic with him, he could instantly top himself off by dropping his Sandwich right before reaching the front. And if the Heavy didn't want to waste his Sandwich, he could negate most of the self-damage by jumping and switching weapons, a technique dubbed GRU skipping. There was also GRU jumping, timing a jump with a tick of self-damage to gain more height, which allowed Heavy to reach places he was never intended to. So not only did the GRU patch up some of Heavy's biggest weaknesses, it did so for free. How did Valve manage to release a weapon that was so blatantly unbalanced? Especially considering that it had been part of a beta test. Isn't the whole point of a beta test to figure out how to balance things before adding them to the game? Well, that beta test was from 2008, back when Heavy was widely considered to be underpowered. This iteration of the GRU, despite essentially having no downsides, would have felt a lot easier to fight against with how exploitable Heavy was back then. The addition of the GRU pushed Heavy's already impressive kit into borderline overpowered territory. It was clear that something needed to change. That change would come in December with the Australian Christmas update. After months of terrorizing the player base, the Natasha was finally nerfed. Its spin-up time was increased, essentially reverting it to how it was before April's minigun buffs. Its slowdown effect was also changed to be weaker at longer ranges, marking the end of Heavy's locking you in place from across the map. After these nerfs, the stock minigun would return to its spot as the superior minigun, but complaints about the Natasha would continue for the rest of the game's life, really. Slowdowns and stuns just aren't fun to fight against. At the very least, the Natasha was no longer omnipresent like it had been before, which was a welcome change. That's not all for this update though, because in addition to the Natasha's nerf, Heavy was given not 2, not 3, but 4 new unlocks. Players were exhausted from how many major changes Heavy had received this year, but luckily for them, the majority of these weapons were underwhelming at best. The Brass Beast on release was mostly the same Brass Beast that we know today. Despite boasting the highest DPS in the game, it's only worth using when defending a single area due to its slower spin-up time and move speed. It turns Heavy into even more of a specialist, to the point that even running the Brass Beast on defense can feel like a liability if you need to change position often. As such, the Brass Beast would not surpass the stock minigun, though the allure of its damage bonus has historically led newer players to assume otherwise. The Buffalo Steak Sandwich was a new lunchbox item with a twist. Once consumed, it would lock Heavy into their melee weapon, boost their movement speed to 311 hammer units per second, and make all damage dealt and received be mini-crits. The movement speed increase originally stacked with the Gru, which let Heavy run faster than any other class in the game, even Scout. However, this was patched just a few days later. More specifically, Heavy speed when under the Steak Sandwich's effects was capped at 311 hammer units per second. After this fix, using the Steak Sandwich as intended was seen as nothing more than a gimmick, but a fun one at that. It's worth noting that the Steak Sandwich could be dropped and used as a medium health pack, just like the regular sandwich. Heavies that only healed themselves via dropping would often use the Steak Sandwich since they didn't lose out on healing and had the option to mess around as melee heavy if they wanted to. The Warrior Spirit was a melee weapon that granted plus 30% damage in exchange for 20 less max health. Clearly, this was designed to be paired with the Steak Sandwich, since any other heavy loadout would rarely use their melee offensively, and thus wouldn't want to deal with the reduced health. With the Steak Sandwich, the Warrior Spirit was decent. A mini-crit boosted hit dealt 114 damage, which two-shot every class but Heavy. Again, using the Steak Sandwich was gimmicky at best, and taking mini-crits on top of having a lower max health made Heavy die surprisingly fast. But it was still fun, which for some players is enough to justify using a weapon. The Brass Beast, Steak Sandwich, and Warrior Spirit also formed their own item set with a unique set bonus. Right off the bat, this set had awful synergy. The set's bonus was a plus 5% resistance to critical hits, which sounds good against snipers until you remember that the Warrior Spirit reduced your max health. So when item set bonuses were removed from the game 3 years later, Heavy players were largely unaffected. Lastly, we have the Fists of Steel. Now this was an unlock that could compare to 2010's other insane Heavy buffs. It reduced damage from all non-melee weapons by 60% while active, which turned Heavy into a true tank. A Heavy with the Fists of Steel out had an effective max health of 750, as in you'd need to deal the equivalent of 750 damage to kill him. If that Heavy was being overhealed, their effective health skyrocketed to 1,125, just shy of the OG Dead Ringer's 1,250. Of course, Heavy having his melee out meant he wasn't much of a threat offensively, but there were plenty of situations where that wasn't an issue. Fleeing from an enemy, crossing sniper sightlines, pushing the payload cart, and so on. As for downsides, the Fists of Steel didn't really have any. Having them active would make you take double damage from melee, but if you saw someone running towards you with their melee out, you could switch to your minigun in response and mow them down. The Fists of Steel and the Gru were like two sides of the same coin. One made Heavy better defensively while the other made Heavy better offensively, and neither had any notable downsides. Players could even use the Steak Sandwich and the Fists of Steel to get the best of both worlds, reaching the fight more quickly with the Steak Sandwich's effects, then abusing the Fists of Steel for maximum survivability. By the end of 2010, Heavy was a completely different class compared to how he was 2 years prior. 2009 had given players a glimpse of what was to come with buffs to the minigun's bullet spread and the ability to drop the sandwich. But no one could have anticipated the sheer quantity of changes that Heavy would receive in the following year. From the Natasha's stealth buff to the 4 new unlocks of the Australian Christmas update, all of it happened within the span of just 1 year. The fact that Heavy was getting so many buffs wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He clearly needed some, if the first 2 years of the game's life are anything to go by. But there were so many changes that it was hard to pinpoint which changes were problematic. The Sandwich and Gru were extremely powerful for no real downside, but were either of them really overpowered on their own? Or did they only feel that way because they were being paired with the pre-nerf Natasha? Regardless, one thing was certain. A growing number of players were starting to loathe fighting Heavy, something that was practically unheard of 2 years prior. After such a hectic year, the first half of 2011 was relatively quiet. The Delocos bar's cooldown, which had been added alongside the Sandwich's cooldown, was removed in the Hatless update of April. You could now eat the Delocos bar infinitely, just like the original Sandwich, but it only healed 60 health at a time. Unsurprisingly, the Delocos bar would remain as one of Heavy's least popular unlocks. The Fists of Steel also received a substantial nerf. Its damage resistance was lowered from 60% to 40%. Now an overhealed Heavy would have an effective health of 750. Still insane, but not as insane as before. Additionally, any Heavy using the Fist of Steel would also have a 20% longer weapon switch speed across all weapons. This was clearly done to dissuade Heavies from taking out their miniguns in response to enemies using melee. It also made using the Sandwich less effective, since it gave the enemy more time to finish a Heavy off before he could drop his Sandwich and heal himself. The Fists of Steel were still quite good after these nerfs, but for the time being, the Gru would rise above it as the go-to Heavy melee. And outside of this update, Heavy received no major changes for the first 5 months of 2011. Finally, players would have time to play as and against this iteration of Heavy, and judge for themselves whether he was balanced or not. It was undeniable that Heavy at this point was better than he'd ever been before. But even after the long list of buffs and new unlocks, Heavy still had the same weaknesses that he had had from the game's start. The Sandwich and Gru reduced these weaknesses considerably, which was a point of contention, but those weaknesses were still there to offer some form of counterplay. And all of those weaknesses hinged upon the design of the stock minigun. No matter how powerful the Sandwich and Gru were, they wouldn't make a difference when it came to actually attacking people with the minigun. Its slow rev up, despite getting buffed in the previous year, was still long enough to let skilled players catch a Heavy by surprise and beat them one-on-one, or at least be able to retreat before getting mowed down. This in turn meant that Heavies would still need to exert some level of positional awareness to be effective, just as the class was intended to. A slow rev-up time also meant that Heavies would want to stay revved even after killing their target in case another comes by, leaving them more open for snipers and spies to prey upon. Yes, the Sandwich and Gru offered insanely powerful benefits for no real downside, and they'd probably need to be tweaked at some point. But as long as Heavy's minigun retained those weaknesses, Heavy wouldn't be without counterplay. Really, the balance of the class as a whole rested on a single stat, the rev-up time of the minigun, which made the reveal of the Tomislav all the more terrifying. Released in the Uber update of June, the Tomislav was one of the most blatantly overpowered weapons to have ever been added to the game. It boasted a 75% faster spin-up time, which made revving up with it near instantaneous. Heavies would no longer need to think about when to rev up or for how long, because the Tomislav made it impossible for anyone to ambush them. Not only that, but revving with the Tomislav was also silent. This would have been useful for hiding around corners and mowing down unsuspecting enemies that pass by. But spinning up was so fast that there was zero reason to stay revved for longer than necessary. All of this was in exchange for a 20% slower firing speed, which equated to a lower DPS compared to stock. Generally speaking, however, that reduced damage was more than made up for by the faster spin-up time. The slower firing speed wasn't entirely bad either, since it also meant less ammo being consumed. The Tomislav, like the Sandwich and the Gru, offered an incredibly powerful perk for no substantial downside. Each of these 3 items significantly reduced at least one of Heavy's intended weaknesses, and they could all be equipped at the same time. The Tomislav, Sandwich, and Gru were used together so often that the loadout was given its own name, Tommy Gruvich, much like another overpowered loadout that came from this update. Valve, upon realizing their mistake, slashed the rev time bonus of the Tomislav in half just a few days later, dropping it from 75% to 40%. This was still incredibly fast, and therefore the question of whether or not to rev still required little to no thought. Jump revving with the Tomislav was insane. You could start firing before you landed, which was especially potent when combined with Gru skipping. This was not the same class that the game had started with. In the first few years of TF2's life, Valve took great care in maintaining a class's weaknesses when it came to balance changes, as they themselves had explained. But over the course of a single year, after multiple buffs and new unlocks, most of Heavy's weaknesses were either reduced significantly or outright negated. Heavy now had enough mobility to keep up with the classes that had a fraction of his health pool and DPS. He had no trouble jumping into or backing out of a fight on the fly. All this, and he still had the same strength that he'd had from the start. Heavy was still an incredible pocket, he was still an incredible defender, and he still required less aim than other high damage classes. By this point, it was obvious that Valve was dead set on buffing Heavy as much as they reasonably could. They were so dedicated to buffing Heavy that even other classes received unlocks that were seemingly designed with Heavy in mind. The Uber update had also given Soldier the disciplinary action, which could boost a Heavy's speed without him needing to use the Gru, and boosted his speed even further with the Gru. Why was Valve doing this? Well, according to Robin Walker, they wanted to make Heavy more comp-friendly. In other words, they wanted to make Heavy more viable and competitive, with 6v6 being the main format at the time. It's true that Heavy has never been a staple of 6s, but this lack of play is not because he isn't useful. Far from it, the 6s community has always recognized that Heavy plays a vital role in the format, with that role being defending the last point. He may not be effective in every situation, but in the situations where he is effective, his power is unmatched. For a class that's designed to be a specialist, this is a good thing. It's a sign that the class is working as intended. If Valve wanted to redesign Heavy into more of a generalist, they'd need to balance out any buffs they give him by nerfing what makes him so powerful defensively, his health and DPS. And Valve did not do this. They tried to, but the downsides they were giving to Heavy's best unlocks were negligible, if not beneficial to the player. The Uber update also gave Heavy 2 other unlocks in addition to the Tomislav, but thankfully those weren't nearly as powerful. The family business initially caught the attention of those who missed when the shotgun was viable. It had an increased clip size, meaning you'd be able to fire more shots before needing to reload. But each of those shots dealt less damage. So it was worse than the shotgun, let alone the Sandwich. As such, it was quickly forgotten. The eviction notice had similarly uninspired stats, a faster firing speed that was nullified by an even larger damage penalty. Seeing Heavy swing his fists so quickly was definitely amusing, but no one in their right mind would ever use this over the Gru or Fists of Steel. The family business and eviction notice were both terrible on release, but even if they were balanced, it's unlikely that anyone would have used them over the Sandwich or the Gru. Heavy's kit was overflowing with broken unlocks by this point. Something needed to be done. But releasing major balance changes with reckless abandon is what had gotten Valve into this mess in the first place. They instead opted to take a break from heavy rebalancing for the next 6 months, leading up to the release of the Holiday Punch in the Australian Christmas update. The Holiday Punch, like the KGB, functioned the same as it does today. Hitting someone with a critical hit, which was guaranteed when from behind, would deal no damage but cause enemies to laugh. Anyone forced to laugh would be as good as dead, either to the Heavy's minigun or a taunt kill. With such a silly concept, the Holiday Punch immediately became a favorite among more casual players, especially with friendly Heavies, otherwise known as Hoovies. However, even in a serious match, the Holiday Punch was a decent choice because it could force even ubered players to laugh. Giving Heavy a way to stuff uber pushes single-handedly could have been game-breaking, but it was kept in check by the fact that it was a melee weapon on the slowest class in the game. If playing on a server with random crits disabled, Heavies would need to not only get within melee range, but also somehow sneak behind people in order to get a crit. It wasn't easy, but the possibility of completely nullifying an uber that would otherwise rip through your team was worth going for. The Holiday Punch was and still is a fun, useful, and balanced weapon. A good sign of things to come, considering how much of a mess the Uber update was just a few months prior. By the end of 2011, Valve had completely revamped Heavy from a defensive stalwart to an offensive juggernaut. Was Heavy overpowered to the point of dominating servers single-handedly? Not exactly. His slow move speed when firing was still exploitable. Valve had at least learned to keep that weakness intact from the Natasha. The problem was that it took much more thought and skill to kill a Heavy than it took the Heavy to kill you. Heavy has always been capable of killing someone in a fraction of a second, but that damage potential was previously balanced out by the positional awareness required to take advantage of it. The Tommy Groovich loadout required 0 positional awareness. You could groove skip to the fight and jump rev around a corner to immediately spit out 500 DPS, all while tanking damage that would be lethal to any other class. If at any point you needed to reposition yourself, you could simply whip the groove back out, with a free medium health pack at your disposal to negate whatever damage the enemy team had done to you. Heavy in this state required little thought or aiming skills, yet was capable of shredding through entire groups of enemies on his own. Valve was too ambitious with buffing their mascot class, and now they were paying the price. Fixing Heavy's balance issues wouldn't be as simple as reverting these buffs, however. Doing so would only result in Heavy being severely underpowered once again. Valve would need to think carefully about which parts of Heavy's kit were balanced and which needed to be scaled back, a difficult task when you consider how many factors were at play. "2012 set the tone for the year in February with a massive nerf to the Sandwich. Picking up a dropped Sandwich would now simply resupply it to the Heavy, rather than healing him. Gone were the days of Heavies giving themselves an effective health of 450 by right-clicking at the ground in front of them. Now, if a Heavy wanted to heal himself with the Sandwich, he'd need to do so by consuming it normally. This change was also applied to the Steak Sandwich, severely limiting its usage to the gimmicky melee-only strat and the occasional rollout to mid. As for the regular Sandwich, it was still Heavy's best secondary by far despite the massive nerf. Tossing the Sandwich will always be incredible for team support, especially for keeping your medic alive. Heavy mains typically wouldn't stop to eat their Sandwich before, but only because of how easy and immediate dropping it was. 300 health in exchange for a 4-second eating animation was still a godsend for a class that soaks up as much damage as Heavy. The only difference was that if a Heavy wanted to heal himself after this nerf, he'd need to, get this, exhibit some positional awareness and find a safe spot to eat. This is exactly the kind of change that Heavy needed. Remove the parts of Heavy's powerful unlocks that were brainless, but keep the parts that required thought and allowed for counterplay. And hey, a nerf to the Sandwich also meant a nerf to the Gru, right? You could no longer heal off the self-damage by dropping a sandwich in front of you. This was true for about 4 months, because 4 months later, in the Pyromania update of June, the GRU received a major rework. Its self-damage was removed entirely. Now, Heavy would be marked for death and take mini-crit damage while the GRU were out and for 3 seconds after putting them away. This meant that using the GRU to reposition or flee in the middle of a fight was not as free as it had been before. It was now significantly worse in more casual games, or on smaller maps where an enemy could be around any corner. But in longer, more serious games, where the GRU's effects on the flow of the game were the most pronounced, it was arguably even better than before. Heavies would no longer have to rely on medics or health packs to get to the fight quickly and at max health, which was especially good news for those that didn't know about GRU skipping in the first place. All they'd need to do now is put the GRU away 3 seconds earlier than they would have previously. Its damage penalty was also reduced from -50% to -25%, letting heavies potentially one-shot light classes with a random crit should they get ambushed, which admittedly was more of a concern now that they'd be taking mini-crits. After this rework, the GRU still granted heavies a massive speed boost, with a downside that could be entirely avoided with basic game sense. It being worse for retreating and repositioning was a good start, but these changes weren't nearly as harsh as some would have liked. No, the harsh nerfs would instead be given to the Tomislav, which saw its rev speed bonus plummet from 40% to 10%. This single change immediately killed the weapon. The Tomislav's slower firing speed, which equated to less damage, was previously made up for by how fast revving up was. Now, the increased rev speed was barely noticeable. Using the Tomislav felt like you were just using a weaker minigun. The silent rev was suddenly the selling point of the weapon. It could be used to get a few surprise kills around corners, but the vast majority of heavy players chose to stick with the stock minigun. Valve had killed the Tomislav, but honestly, I don't blame them. Heavy's relatively slow rev up is a crucial part of what keeps his power in check, so making a minigun with a faster rev up would be incredibly difficult to balance. Perhaps Valve will take another crack at the Tomislav later down the line, but for the time being, it would be left as one of Heavy's worst miniguns. Don't feel too bad for Heavy players though, because just 2 months later, Valve would release a brand new minigun, the Hualong Heater. This minigun was Valve's attempt at giving Heavy a pseudo Razorback. While revved up, the Hualong Heater would emit a ring of flames around you. Spies would need to willingly ignite themselves in order to backstab a Heavy, making it nearly impossible for them to escape afterwards. Or at least that's how it was supposed to work. In practice, however, yeah, the ring of fire can be completely avoided by just jumping over it. And even if spies weren't aware of this, they could use the Dead Ringer, by far the most equipped Invis watch at this time, to extinguish themselves and retreat. The Ring of Fire was practically worthless. It dealt 30 damage per second to anyone in the ring, but dealing damage at point blank range while revved up has never been a concern for heavies. If anything, the Ring of Fire was only detrimental because it blocked your vision when looking down. Such a minuscule upside came at the massive cost of consuming 6 ammo per second when revved, on top of any ammo consumed from firing. Heavy's miniguns were already notorious for chewing through ammo surprisingly quickly, so adding even more ammo consumption on top of that led most to completely disregard the weapon. Now, the fact that the ammo consumption was the only downside meant that in situations where ammo wasn't a concern, namely pushing the payload cart, the Hualong Heater was technically a straight upgrade. Still, the Ring of Fire was so lackluster that even with infinite ammo, you'd hardly notice a difference from stock. As such, the Hualong Heater was rarely used. And although heavy players wouldn't know it at the time, the Hualong Heater would be the last new minigun to be added to the game. Looking back at all of Heavy's unlockable miniguns reveals a worrying pattern. They all encourage slight variations of the same playstyle. By 2012, most other classes had gotten at least one unlock that significantly changed the way they played. Sniper had the Huntsman, Engineer had the Gunslinger, Demo had his swords and shields, and so on. Heavy pretty much only had one playstyle. Nerfing that playstyle would mean nerfing the class as a whole. Heavy's kit had traces of variety. For example, one could argue that the buffalo steak sandwich created a melee-focused subclass not unlike Demo Knight. At the same time, however, no one would argue that any of Heavy's secondaries were better than the sandwich. No one would argue that any of Heavy's melees were better than the Gru or Fists of Steel. If Valve wanted to add some variety to Heavy's gameplay, they'd need to buff his other unlocks significantly. Valve attempted to do this in July of 2013 by buffing the buffalo steak sandwich. When under the steak sandwich's effects, Heavy would now take 25% more damage as opposed to mini-crits. This alone was an improvement, but it gets even better. As we'd find out later, this damage multiplier was bugged. It actually only increased damage taken by 10%. However, I couldn't find a single person talking about this before it was eventually fixed in 2016. Which just goes to show how unpopular the steak sandwich was even after this buff. This same update also saw a buff to the Delocos bar, which increased the amount healed from eating it to 100, up from 60. This still wasn't enough to compete with the sandwich, and so it continued to be rarely used. Ironically, the most significant Heavy buff of 2013 wasn't to him directly, but to Medic. The Crusader's crossbow had been in the game for a few years by this point, but it wasn't until 2013 Scream Fortress that the crossbow became a must-use for any serious medic. Its reload time was dropped from 3 seconds to 1.5 seconds, and was changed to reload passively, as in it would reload itself even if you switched weapons. Burst healing every 1.5 seconds along with the steady healing of the medigun in between shots is incredibly powerful. Heavy, being the slowest class in the game, was the easiest class to hit crossbow shots, making him an even better pocket than he had been prior. The major buffs for Heavy have, unsurprisingly, run dry by this point. Valve's focus for Heavy in 2012 was to fix the Tommy Groovich loadout, which they partially succeeded in. The sandwich was now balanced, while the Tomislav was gutted and the Gru had hardly changed at all. 2013 showed signs of Valve buffing underused unlocks to add some variety to Heavy's playstyle, though their changes failed to make an impact. At the very least, Heavy no longer had any blatantly unbalanced unlocks aside from the Gru. That then raises an important question. What now? Where should Valve take the class from here? 2014 continued the trend of addressing underused unlocks in February with a buff to the Natasha. Ever since its nerf a few years prior, the Natasha had been in a limbo state regarding its balance. Using the Natasha felt underwhelming due to its slower rev up and reduced damage, yet dying to the Natasha made it seem unbeatable because of its slowdown. With this patch, the Natasha would now have 300 ammo at its disposal, up from 200. All this change did was encourage Heavies to mindlessly spam the Natasha at people for longer than they would have before. Remember, its slowdown still affected people at long range, albeit less so than at closer ranges. After this buff, the Natasha would remain in that limbo state of feeling overpowered and underpowered at the same time. And really, that sentiment could be used to describe Heavy as a whole by 2014. Some felt that Heavy needed to be nerfed, others thought he needed some buffs, and others still wanted a total rework of the class. Those that played competitive 6s felt that stock Heavy, while not very engaging to fight against, was balanced. It was the existence of certain unlocks that they took issue with. With those items being banned from play, Heavy in 6s was relegated to defending final points and maybe pushing into final points on smaller maps like Gullywash. He was effective when used at the right time, but never overwhelmingly so. It was also around this time that another competitive format began to rise in popularity, Highlander. Matches here were 9 versus 9, with both teams having one of each class. Now this was a format that Heavy could really shine in. Highlander games were typically played on King of the Hill and Payload, game modes where mobility isn't as important as in 5CP. Therefore, Heavy's slow speed was less of a hindrance than in 6's, especially since you could always count on having an engineer on your team to keep teleporters up and running. At the same time, however, the enemy team would always have a competent sniper and spy to keep Heavy in check. Other classes could easily punish any Heavy that was out of place with focus fire, which wasn't hard to coordinate since being on a call with your team was expected. Heavy in Highlander was balanced. Heavy in 6's was balanced. Heavy in pubs, however, that was a different story. Competent snipers and spies could keep Heavy in check in Highlander, but with how high the skill floors for those classes are, Heavy players wouldn't need to be as wary of them in pubs. Focus fire, another one of Heavy's weaknesses, required coordination and was therefore also rare in pubs. Stacking Heavies, which was only possible in pubs due to the lack of class limits, often felt like an automatic win, especially on payload offense. And that's to say nothing of Heavy medic combos, which were as powerful as ever. Heavy in pubs wasn't overpowered like he'd been in 2011, but the general consensus among casual players was that he was too easy to play relative to how powerful he was. In short, opinions on Heavy's balance were split between casual and competitive players. Valve was at a crossroads. Which group should they be catering their balance changes to? They had just spent the last 2 years scaling back some of the many buffs that were explicitly for competitive, so maybe now was the time to start balancing Heavy around casual play instead. It was only a few years prior that Heavy was almost universally agreed to be underpowered in all levels of play. So what major changes were made since then that could be making Heavy such a pain to fight in pubs? The Tomislav was a shell of its former self. The Sandwich only caused major complaints when Heavies could heal themselves by dropping it, which Valve already fixed. The Fists of Steel were still a powerful option, but less so than originally. As for the Gru, yes, they still gave Heavy speed for no significant downside. But from a casual player's perspective, it wasn't immediately obvious that giving Heavy free mobility was a bad idea. If they died to a Heavy jump revving around the corner, they probably wouldn't know that the Heavy was only able to get to that position by using the Gru. And if it wasn't the Gru, there was just one major buff left that had yet to be scaled back: the minigun buffs from April of 2010. Heavy's movement speed while revved was not an issue. He was still slow enough to make him crumble to focus fire or allow enemies to run away. But as for the rev speed buff, that might have been a bit too much in retrospect. If you ambushed a Heavy, you only had 0.8 seconds to kill him before he'd start spitting out over 500 DPS and mow you down. And if the Heavy spent most of that rev time by jumping around the corner, anyone unlucky enough to be on the other side was dead. There was nothing they could do. Heavy's rev speed buff being overtuned was actually something that a lot of people expressed in the years following 2010. It's just that their complaints were overshadowed by much larger issues. By 2014, those larger issues had mostly been dealt with. And so, in the Love and War update of June, Valve would unveil their next nerf for Heavy, a reworking of the rev speed buff from 2010. As of this update, the time it took to rev up would remain the same, but all miniguns would now have damage and accuracy ramp-ups. What this meant was that after revving up, all miniguns would start with 50% damage and reduced accuracy, both of which would increase to 100% after 1 second of firing. The message from Valve was clear. They wanted to neuter the effectiveness of Heavy outside of his intended defensive role. After years of buffs and nerfs, Valve had seemingly given up on trying to make Heavy work as a generalist. With this single nerf, the class was essentially back at square one. The only ways to play Heavy effectively were with a pocket medic or on defense. Any Heavy that dared to roam the map alone was now punished with middling damage for the first 2 seconds of an encounter, giving enemies more than enough time to kill the Heavy or run away. The fact that Heavy was back to relying on his teammates to be effective isn't necessarily a bad thing. A Heavy with proper team support was still terrifying, just as a level 3 sentry with proper team support is terrifying. It's okay for weapons and playstyles to not be effective in every situation, but the problem with Heavy was that the entire class was a single situational playstyle. Even Engineer, the other defensive specialist class, had the Gunslinger, a weapon that trades area denial for flexibility and offensive pressure. That's what Heavy needed, more variety. Before this nerf, the stock minigun was seen by many to be the only viable minigun, but at least there was some flexibility in how it could be used, allowing for some variety. After this nerf, the solo flank roaming playstyle for Heavy was no longer viable, likely due to complaints about it being too easy. If that was the issue, then why not nerf it in a way that makes it require more skill for the same results? Especially considering that Heavy was far from overpowered in both Highlander and Sixes. To the players of those formats, this nerf seemed completely unnecessary. And I haven't even gotten to the worst part. Not only would Heavies need to fire for a full second to get max damage and accuracy, but if they stopped firing at any point, the ramp up was immediately reset. If you wanted to keep your damage and accuracy, you'd need to keep firing at all times. So even playing Heavy defensively, the thing Valve was clearly pushing for, was nerfed. You'd need to waste ammo shooting at a wall or the ground at all times to maintain the high DPS that Heavy needs for effective area denial. Heavies were forced to either play right next to a dispenser or ammo pickup, or conserve their ammo at the cost of reduced damage every time they started firing. Intentional or not, this was one of the largest nerfs that a class had ever received up to this point. And yet, no one seemed to care. Why? Because the Love and War update also included what is possibly the biggest nerf of all time. Demoman stickies were given an even worse damage ramp up when detonated mid-air, leading to them dealing as little as 30 damage. This caused a massive uproar among the community, which drew attention away from Heavy's less severe but still terrible nerf. Making matters worse, the nerf made to stickies was reverted by Valve just a few days later. Were they gonna do the same for Heavy? Well, they'd scaled the Heavy nerf back slightly a month later by allowing the minigun's accuracy ramp up to increase via revving without needing to fire. However, the damage ramp up still required a full second of firing, and both ramp ups would still reset once you stopped firing. The issue of needing to waste ammo to maintain your DPS was still there, meaning Heavy was still gimped both offensively and defensively. This nerf was so bad that some saw it as Valve trying to make the shotgun more viable on Heavy, which was never going to happen so long as it and the Sandwich shared the same slot. Though I shouldn't speak so soon, because the Smithsmith update of 2014 brought with it a brand new shotgun for Heavy, the Panic Attack. Upon its release, the Panic Attack functioned much like the Beggar's Bazooka. You could load up to 4 shots to fire in rapid succession. It also had a mechanic where its firing rate and weapon spread increased as your health decreased. For some reason. It was really bad. Somehow even worse than the Family Business, which was already a direct downgrade from stock. Suffice to say, the addition of the Panic Attack did not soften the blow from the minigun nerfs. And outside of the Panic Attack, Heavy wouldn't be given anything of note for an entire year following Love and War. Valve had broken their class with a terribly implemented nerf, and it seemed like they were standing by that nerf. To say Heavy players were feeling neglected was an understatement. Their class had been given nothing but nerfs for the past 2 years. The few buffs that Valve tried giving Heavy went absolutely nowhere. The days of game-breaking buffs were long gone, and with Love and War, Heavy was in many ways given a clean slate. This was bad news to anyone that enjoyed playing the class, but to Valve, it was also an opportunity for them to learn from their mistakes. Maybe, just maybe, they could get back to buffing their mascot class, only this time they'd do so more carefully. And in the Gunmetal update of July 2015, Valve did just that. Heavy was given a long list of changes, and every single one of them was a buff. Were any of those buffs actually significant? Let's jump right in and find out, starting with a universal buff to all miniguns. Since the game's launch, sentry guns have had an innate resistance to minigun damage. Level 2s resisted 20% of the damage, while level 3s resisted 33%. This was fine back in 2007, before sentry guns could even be picked up and moved. But after unlocks like the Rescue Ranger as well as the Love and War heavy nerfs, it was a bit strange how the class with the supposed highest DPS struggled so much against sentries. Gunmetal fixed this by lowering the resistances of level 2 and level 3 sentries to 15 and 20% respectively, making heavies a bit better at pushing offensively. As for specific miniguns, the Natasha slowdown effect was given distance falloff, meaning that it would no longer slow anyone down past around 1500 hammer units, which was well overdue. Its increased ammo was also removed for the much more useful perk of a 20% damage resistance while spun up. This same perk was also given to another underused minigun, the Brass Beast. Revving up with either of these miniguns gave Heavy an effective max health of 375, which could be increased into the 500s with Overheal. The Natasha and Brass Beast were still poor choices offensively, but this buff made them much better defensively. Now, not even a fully charged headshot could take out an overhealed Heavy defending the point. The Delocos bar was given an alt fire like its fellow lunchbox items, now dropping a small medkit with a 10-second cooldown. Eating the Delocos bar at close to full health would also now grant up to 50 overheal on top of increasing max health by 50, meaning heavies could give themselves up to 400 health. This made a lot of sense, seeing how the original purpose of the Delocos bar was to give heavies their own pseudo overheal, only now it was the real thing. Was this enough to dethrone the sandwich? Not even close. But for the first time since its inception, the Delocos bar wasn't completely worthless. That 100 extra health could allow a heavy to survive an encounter and escape in one piece. The Warrior Spirit was buffed to grant 10 health on hit. 10 health. I'm sorry Valve, but this wouldn't be enough to make the Warrior Spirit worth using. The Eviction Notice was given a 3-second speed boost on hit. Again, this wouldn't be enough to make the weapon worth using, but it made a funny weapon slightly funnier, so no complaints there I guess. The Family Business and Panic Attack were given a 15% faster firing speed, while the latter also had its reload and switch 2 speeds increased. These were, yet again, buffs that really didn't affect anything outside of joke loadouts. Last but not least was the Tomislav. If there was any weapon that represented Valve's failures to balance heavy in the past, it was this one. The Tomislav was also among the most difficult heavy unlocks to balance. How could Valve make a minigun with a faster rev time that wasn't either overpowered or worthless? Well, they started by doubling its rev speed bonus from 10% to 20%. Revving up with the Tomislav was noticeably faster once again, but it was also just long enough that the question of whether or not to pre-rev was still relevant. A 20% faster rev speed is also just enough to bunny hop with, meaning you can continuously jump rev and not lose any speed until you decide to start firing. The Tomislav's accuracy was also increased by 20%, ergo its bullet spread was reduced. This made the Tomislav the best minigun for mid-range combat, since the slower firing rate was made up for by more bullets landing compared to stock. But a tighter cone was also a downside in a sense, because it meant tracking was much more important for dealing damage, especially on top of that slower firing rate. Players with poor tracking would ironically do better with the stock minigun, since the bullet spread would be helping them more than hurting them. So this new version of the Tomislav had a rev speed bonus that was significant, but not to the point that it trivialized the act of revving up. Its accuracy bonus also meant that it required precise tracking to use effectively, but doing so would reward the player with damage comparable to stock beyond point-blank range. This was perfect. Heavy historically has been balanced around requiring positional awareness rather than precise aim, so any minigun that makes positional awareness less of an issue should require better aim as a result. The Tomislav was now an excellent choice for heavies that wanted to roam the map on their own, a playstyle that had been dead since Love and War. Speaking of, the Love and War nerfs meant that the Tomislav Silent Rev was practically useless. But to heavy players, that didn't matter. They were just happy to finally have some variety. Something beyond just defending a point or pub stomping with the pocket medic. While Gunmetal finally gave heavy players more viable miniguns to choose from, the Tough Break update of December sought to do the same for heavy's melees. The Fist of Steel's 20% slower switch speed across all weapons was removed in exchange for a 100% longer holster time, or the time it takes to put a weapon away. This was supposed to be a nerf that made taking the Fist of Steel out more of a commitment, but all holster time penalties in TF2 can very easily be bypassed by cycling through all 3 weapons in quick succession. Granted, a heavy might only have 2 weapons at his disposal if he had just dropped his sandwich, but giving a weapon a downside that could be completely avoided even some of the time was questionable. The Fists of Steel would remain an excellent choice despite the attempted nerf. The Gru was also given a nerf in this update. 2012's nerf of marking the user for death could be avoided pretty easily by just switching off of it a few seconds early, so it's good to see Valve going back to rectify this. And they did so by also giving the Gru a holster time penalty. Again, this could be very easily avoided so long as you had your sandwich. Even if you didn't know this, an increased holster time didn't mean much when heavies were already used to giving themselves a few seconds to switch off of the Gru ahead of time. Just like in 2012, the Gru was given a nerf that was less impactful than Valve would have liked. The 2 best melees for heavy were supposedly nerfed, so it only made sense for Valve to buff the 2 worst melees as well. The Warrior Spirit's pathetic 10 health on hit was exchanged for an improved 50 health on kill. However, its health penalty was also exchanged for a 30% damage vulnerability when active. This may have been preferred for loadouts that only use their melee some of the time, but if you were using the Warrior Spirit, you were going all in with a stake sandwich. So in that sense, Valve somehow managed to make the Warrior Spirit even worse. Whoops. The Eviction Notice, which had only been used as a joke weapon up until this point, was given a 15% move speed bonus as well as a 20% damage vulnerability when active. For heavies that wanted to use their melees offensively, the Eviction Notice was still a poor choice. But as a mobility tool, this new Eviction Notice was really good. That might sound confusing. How could the Eviction Notice compete with the Gru, which offered twice as much speed? It all has to do with their respective downsides. The Gru's mark for death persisted for 3 seconds after putting them away. This wasn't an issue when getting from spawn to the fight so long as you switched off of them a few seconds early. But trying to use them in the middle of a fight would typically lead to taking massive amounts of damage. The damage vulnerability of the Eviction Notice, on the other hand, went away the moment you switched weapons, making them a great tool for repositioning. When used properly, it was literally free mobility. That might have been a point of contention for some, but so long as the Gru existed, any complaints about giving heavy more speed would be directed towards that instead. In retrospect, Tough Break's Eviction Notice was much better than most gave them credit for. Only the more experienced heavy mains at the time considered using them over the Gru for the many situations where the Eviction Notice was superior. It was an excellent new addition to Heavy's arsenal, one that largely slipped under the radar despite having such an easily avoided downside. Beyond Heavy's melees, the only other weapon to receive any changes in Tough Break was the Panic Attack. Players could now hold and fire their shots at will. Previously, they were forced to fire after loading 4 shots. Like I said in Gunmetal, shotguns will never be worth using over the sandwich in any serious match. But for those that wanted to mess around as a fat scout, this new iteration of the Panic Attack was admittedly pretty fun. Heavy in 2014 was a mess of a class, mostly as a result of a single poorly implemented nerf. The addition of the accuracy and damage ramp-ups, along with the lack of viable miniguns outside of stock, made Heavy exploitable to the point that he was only effective on defense or with a pocket medic. He was, in a way, reverted back to how he was at the start of the game's life. And with both Gunmetal and Tough Break in 2015, Valve took this as an opportunity to buff Heavy the right way. The Tomislav was revived as the perfect side grade for offense. A handful of other unlocks were given buffs that ranged from negligible to massive. Finally, Valve was getting back to fleshing Heavy out as a class and giving him more variety. But as most of you know, there are only a few major updates past 2015, so let's see if Valve made good use of their limited time. The Meet Your Match update of July 2016 picked up where Gunmetal left off by buffing yet another underused minigun, the Hualong Heater. This thing has essentially been a direct downgrade ever since its release back in 2013. The Ring of Fire was only good for igniting spies, and it couldn't even do that well. With this update, the Hualong Heater was given a minus 10% damage penalty overall, but that damage could be increased by 25% when firing at burning players. This gave the Ring of Fire a secondary purpose, igniting players to then deal increased damage. I'd said that dealing damage at point blank range wasn't a concern for Heavy back in 2013. But after the Love and War nerfs, that extra damage could mean the difference between dying to an ambush or not. Speaking of Love and War, those nerfs also meant that users of the Hualong Heater would need to choose between suffering from ramp up every time they fired, or burning through all of their ammo even faster than stock. The ammo drain was reduced in this update, dropping from minus 6 per second to minus 4, but it was still enough to dissuade most heavies from using the weapon. Valve also felt the need to lower the damage of the Ring of Fire itself by a whopping 6 DPS to compensate for the new increased damage perk. This changed absolutely nothing, of course. It's just hilarious that Valve even bothered. All in all, the Hualong Heater was still one of Heavy's least used miniguns, but it wasn't completely inferior to stock like it had been before, and it even introduced a new dynamic of encouraging Heavies to work with friendly pyros. The Natasha and Brass Beast, on the other hand, were actually nerfed in this update. Their damage resistances from Gunmetal would now only apply when spun up and below half health. Due to how this resistance is coded, Heavies would still survive fully charged headshots after this nerf. But as for everything else, that resistance was nowhere near as useful as it had been before. It had the same issue as the Delocos bar. Even if that resistance let you survive by the skin of your teeth, good luck escaping back to safety before someone else catches up to finish you off. This was a nerf that had everyone scratching their heads. Who was complaining about the Natasha and the Brass Beast? Well, people were complaining about the Natasha, but only because of the slowdown. My guess is that Valve thought these miniguns were too powerful on defense, but most players didn't feel that way. In any case, both the Natasha and Brass Beast went from somewhat usable to underpowered once again. Ironically, the best change for Heavy in this update wasn't to him, but to Engineer. Teleporters would now cost a mere 50 metal to build, down from the previous 125. This made teleporters much more common, which was obviously great news for the slowest class in the game. The Meet Your Match update was extremely underwhelming for Heavy, which was especially disappointing seeing how the updates from 2015 were so promising. That might have been the point though, because the Meet Your Match update was also the Meet versus Match update. By choosing a side and scoring points in-game, players could vote for one of two classes to receive their very own update, Heavy or Pyro, an update that would bring new weapons and balance changes to whichever class won, and only to that class. This essentially confirmed that Valve saw Heavy in the exact same way as everyone else. He was a class that was severely lacking in options, something that a dedicated update could do wonders for. There was just one problem. This election was rigged from the start. Heavy in 2016 had a lot of issues, but he was at the very least mechanically functional. His minigun worked exactly how Valve wanted it to, for better or for worse. Pyro, on the other hand, was literally a broken class. The flamethrowers were riddled with bugs. including but not limited to flame particles not matching visuals and the distance that flame particles traveled being affected by latency. Once the event ended in August, it was Team Pyro that won with 56% of the votes. It was Pyro that was getting his very own update, not Heavy. And with the gaps between major updates growing longer and longer, it felt like Heavy was never gonna get the attention he needed at this rate. Even a single new weapon that wasn't completely worthless would suffice. Just something, anything. Was that really too much to ask? Over a year after Meet Your Match, the Pyro update, otherwise known as Jungle Inferno, would finally drop in October of 2017. Pyro was given a ton of balance changes and 4 new unlocks that ranged from worthless to amazing. That amazing new unlock also turned Pyro from heavy fodder into a heavy melting machine, which heavy players were less than keen about. That was to be expected though. Pyro had won the election, and Heavy had lost. And Valve made extra sure to rub it in the faces of Heavy players that they had indeed lost. So much so that they even took it upon themselves to give Heavy a new, terrible joke weapon, the second banana. An awful unlock that Heavy players tried out as a novelty once the update was available to play. And they kept using it. As it turned out, the second banana was actually really good. Like, good enough to give the sandwich competition. I genuinely don't think this was Valve's intention. The name Second Banana is less than flattering, and Heavy certainly doesn't look happy with it in the official art. Even its stats seem like they'd cancel each other out. It recharges 50% faster, but heals 33% less. So how did it end up being good enough to rival the sandwich? Well, first off, it actually recharges 66% faster, with a 10-second cooldown compared to the sandwich's 30 seconds. A 10-second cooldown that starts the moment you start eating it, resulting in the second banana recharging a mere 6 seconds after the eating animation. More importantly, however, the second banana heals 200 health compared to the sandwich's 300. That's still more than enough to get an injured Heavy back into the fight, and with a recharge time so fast that it's practically infinite, the second banana is by far the best option for self-healing. The only reason why it's not a direct upgrade to the sandwich is that dropping it only gives a small health pack, making it much worse for team support and especially for protecting medics. For Heavies that prefer roaming on their own though, the second banana is their #1 choice. This was an amazing new unlock that came out of nowhere. One could argue that Heavy got the best new unlock of the Pyro update. It's seriously that good. And despite Jungle Inferno technically being the Pyro update, most classes received a significant amount of balance changes, including Heavy. Just like in Tough Break, the main focus for Heavy was reworking his 2 most used melees, the Gru and the Fists of Steel. The Gru's Marked for Death effect was removed and replaced with a health drain. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Unlike the original Gru, however, this iteration would drain the user's max health, meaning it couldn't simply be healed off. This health drain couldn't be Gru skipped either. Valve thought ahead and made it so deploying the Gru would automatically lower your max health by 20 on top of the gradual health drain. Attempting to Gru skip will only make you lose health even faster. Did this mean that the weapon was nerfed into oblivion? That's what most people thought initially, but over time players have remembered that speed on Heavy will always be insanely powerful. The main difference between today's Gru and previous versions is that you have to think much more about when you use them and when you put them away. The fact that your max health regenerates after holstering the Gru means that you technically don't lose any health so long as you stay alive. It rewards good positioning with free mobility, and punishes bad positioning by turning you into a 100 health Heavy that gets obliterated at mid. The removal of the Marked for Death effect also made the Gru a great option for repositioning and fleeing once again, something that it hadn't been able to do for years. Its old damage penalty was also removed entirely, making the Gru the best that it's ever been at attacking. All in all, the Gru is still one of Heavy's best melees, if not the best. And now that I think about it, this version of the Gru gives the Dilocospar a new use case. You can eat it before the round starts to give yourself 400 health and offset the Gru's health drain. It was a good combo on paper, but in practice, it was a little too good. Between the Dilocospar increasing our max health, overhealing you, and the Gru's max health drain, TF2 Spaghetti Code had a hard time keeping track of all the health modulations, resulting in an exploit where Heavies could give themselves infinite health. This was fixed in a patch one day later, but part of this fix made it so that the Dilocospar would no longer overheal you if eaten at full health, which effectively removed the overheal mechanic entirely. The Dilocospar wasn't great even with the overheal, but it was unfortunately caught in the crossfire and nerfed as a result of the Gru's janky health drain. The Gru didn't stop at the Dilocospar though, because it caused the death of the Eviction Notice as well. With it being another melee that boosted heavy speed, the Eviction Notice's damage vulnerability was also replaced with a max health drain. A max health drain that's slower than the Gru's, but also regenerates slower than the Gru's. There is no reason to use the Eviction Notice anymore. It's completely outclassed by the Gru as a mobility tool. Valve really should have just removed the speed boost so the Eviction Notice could at least go back to being a funny joke weapon, but now it's not even worth using for that. With the Gru now being usable as a repositioning tool, however, the loss of the Eviction Notice wasn't as big of a deal as it otherwise would have been. As for the Fist of Steel, which has consistently been a contender for Heavy's best melee since 2010, it was given two new penalties: a 40% reduced overheal and healing rate when active. This was done to make a pocketed Fist of Steel Heavy on the objective a bit easier to take out, which was totally fair. But there were a few issues with how these penalties were implemented. Both the overheal and healing rate penalties only apply if a medic starts healing you after you've taken the Fist of Steel out. If the medic was already healing you beforehand, then the penalties wouldn't kick in. This also means that if a medic starts healing you when you have your Fist of Steel out and switch to your minigun, the overheal and healing rate penalties will continue to affect you. That sounds like an annoying quirk to the weapon that would make it not worth using, but there's a silver lining. The overheal penalty means that you're always building Uber at a faster rate. Most methods of building Uber involve self-damage, meaning you need to either sit and spawn or risk getting caught and killed before you can retaliate. Exploiting the Fist of Steel lets you build Uber while still playing normally. This is incredibly broken, and as of making this video, it still hasn't been fixed by Valve. So were the Fist of Steel even nerfed at all? To anyone that knows how to exploit them, no, this was a massive buff. Even outside of building Uber, the Fist of Steel are still an excellent unlock for tanking damage, which is especially good news considering how much sniper mains have improved over the past few years. Beyond Heavy's melees, the only other unlocks to receive any changes were the Panic Attack and the Buffalo Steak Sandwich. The Panic Attack was reworked entirely, with it now functioning as a standard shotgun with a faster switch speed. This was great for Soldier, Pyro, and Engineer, not so much for Heavy. You could combine it with the holster speed bypass of the Fist of Steel to demolish anyone trying to melee you, but generally speaking, the other two shotguns are superior for a playstyle that's not very effective to begin with. As for the Buffalo Steak Sandwich, all of the changes made to it weren't actually documented. None of them are listed in the official patch notes. In the days following Jungle Inferno, players found that the effect duration of the Steak Sandwich had been increased from 15 to 16 seconds, and its damage vulnerability was reduced from plus 25% to plus 20%. Huh, I guess Valve still wants to try making the Steak Sandwich worth using, but then why didn't they say so in the patch notes? Well, those two minor buffs were likely done to counteract one massive nerf to the weapon, a nerf that also went undocumented. The speed boost granted by the Steak Sandwich was lowered from 311 hammer units per second to 299. With classes like Pyro and Sniper running at 300 hammer units per second, A steak sandwich heavy will now outpace just 3 of the 9 classes. This is why the Gru stacks with a steak sandwich now when it didn't before. The Gru's 30% faster move speed doesn't completely stack on top though. A steak sandwich heavy using the Gru runs at 311 hammer units per second, the same as the speed cap that was added back in 2010 to prevent the Gru from stacking with the steak sandwich, because that used to be the speed bonus of the steak sandwich itself. Valve nerfed the speed bonus but forgot to change the speed cap. They literally nerfed one of Heavy's worst weapons. Why? My only guess is that they didn't want players to use the steak sandwich to roll out to mid in lieu of the Gru, making for the 3rd Heavy unlock that was killed as a result of the Gru's rebalancing. Like with the Delocos bar and to a lesser extent the eviction notice, the steak sandwich getting nerfed wasn't a huge loss to anyone that played even somewhat seriously. Still, it's frustrating that Valve couldn't figure out how to remove the unintended uses of these unlocks without neutering their intended purposes as well. The changes made to Heavy in Jungle Inferno were a mixed bag, but don't worry, I've saved the best change for last. The Love and War minigun nerfs, which had been frustrating Heavy players for over 3 years, were finally fixed. As of Jungle Inferno, the damage and accuracy ramp-ups now apply to the first second of spun-up time, and both ramp-ups now reset upon spinning down rather than when the Heavy stops firing. Heavies no longer needed to waste ammo shooting at the ground to keep their DPS, they only need to stay revved up. This was especially good news for the Tomislav, which could finally abuse its silent rev to the fullest. If you turn a corner to find a revved up Tomislav Heavy, you're going to take that maximum DPS to the face. Jungle Inferno may have killed some of Heavy's less popular unlocks for seemingly no reason, but between the Love and War nerfs getting fixed, the addition of the second banana, and both the Gru and Fist of Steel getting buffs on top of their nerfs to keep them viable, this update was a good one for Heavy overall. The traditional defensive playstyle was improved by the ramp-up changes and, unintentionally, by the Fist of Steel exploits. But, perhaps more importantly, playing Heavy as more of a generalist, roaming the map alone, was more viable after Jungle Inferno than it had been since 2011. The new Gru and second banana combined with the Tomislav is essentially the Tommy Groovich loadout done right. The Tomislav lets Heavies roam without needing to worry as much about pre-revving, but they need to have better aim than with stock. The second banana's near instant recharge makes self-healing extremely reliable, while still requiring thought and offering counterplay, unlike the old sandwich that healed on drop. And the Gru gives Heavies the same speed boost that it always has, while rewarding smart usage and punishing overusage more than any other iteration. Does this loadout turn Heavy into a highly mobile DM machine like Scout? No. Does the Gunslinger do the same for Engineer? Also no. The point of these unlocks is to let the defensive classes not feel like a liability on offense, while also toning down their potential power to compensate. After a decade of buffs and nerfs, Valve finally figured out how to make Heavy feel a bit more like a generalist, without losing his identity or breaking the game. Beyond Jungle Inferno, there's just one more change that I feel is worth mentioning. A buff to the Natasha in the Blue Moon update of March 2018. Players had discovered that they could easily bypass most of the Natasha's slowdown by strafing back and forth on the ground, which Valve tried to fix. Valve trying to fix the Natasha's buggy slowdown effect. That certainly does sound familiar. But surely Valve knows what to do now, right? And just like that, Valve unleashed the 2010 Natasha onto the player base for the second time. Thankfully, they quietly reverted this just a few patches later, but it just goes to show that some things never change. And after over 14 years of new unlocks and balance changes, this is the state that Heavy remains in today. So how has Heavy evolved since TF2's release back in 2007? The history of Heavy's ever-changing design philosophy has always revolved around the class's identity as a specialist. In the first few years of TF2's life, Heavy was a specialist to a fault. He was only worth using when defending or with a pocket medic. And even in those situations, he could struggle due to the many limitations that were placed on Heavy to keep his immense power in check. His slow speed, the rev times of the minigun, the wide cone of fire, and so on. Heavy would start receiving significant buffs as early as 2008, most notably with the Sandwich, which allowed Heavies to keep themselves healthy without the aid of a pocket medic. Then came the bullet spread buff of 2009, allowing Heavies to immediately threaten enemies beyond point-blank range. But throughout 2010 and into the Uber update of 2011, Heavy would be blessed with a flurry of buffs and new unlocks, many of which either reduced or outright negated his weaknesses without reducing his strengths to compensate. The end result was a class that had all the strengths of a specialist, without any of the limitations that had kept those strengths in check. Heavy's best unlocks granted him the flexibility of a generalist, which when combined with his pre-existing strengths, allowed him to beat any other class without much thought or skill. Conversely, it took a great deal of thought and skill for anyone else to kill a competent Heavy in this state. Valve was quick to rectify their mistake by nerfing the components of the Tommy Groovich loadout in 2012 to varying degrees of success. However, they'd make a severe overcorrection in 2014 with the Love and War minigun nerfs, which neutered Heavy's effectiveness even in his intended defensive role. A handful of notable buffs, such as the Tomislav and Eviction Notice, would soften the blow from these nerfs. But it wasn't until 2017's Jungle Inferno that they were finally changed to no longer make Heavies waste ammo to maintain their ramp up. This same update also blessed Heavies with the second banana and an incredibly well thought out rework for the GRU. These two changes, along with Gunmetal's Tomislav, achieved what Valve had been trying to do for over a decade: allow Heavies to play a bit more aggressively, while still requiring thought and skill to do so. Oh, and the Buffalo Steak Sandwich was somehow nerfed more often than buffed. This class, like any other, has been through both highs and lows over the years. Is Heavy today more balanced than he's been in the past? Just like in the last video, I'd like you to reach your own conclusion and share it in the comments. As always, thanks for watching, and special thank you to my patrons.